So, Asha, how bad is it going to get in the new year?
Eh, it's complicated. I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet.
So, this is going to be, I think, coming out right around the new year, and this will be our essentially look ahead at what's going on and going to be what we expect to be happening in 2025.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people are dreading it. I'm dreading it. I'm kind of in denial still a little bit. I don't know. Do you wake up sometimes and you're like, I cannot believe we're doing this again?
Yeah, I'm in the acceptance stage of everything. So I accept that this is what's going to happen. And I definitely see a variety of potential outcomes. And I'm very anxious to see which version of autocracy we're going to get. That's essentially where I'm at with it.
Yeah, I think what people need to really think about is that my sense, just from listening to the scholars on this and sort of looking at how this is manifested in different ways around the world, is that, it's not going to look like Putin's Russia. Right. And so I think what that means is, fortunately, I think, and hopefully these are not famous last words, it's not going to be black vans, showing up in the middle of the night and abducting people in the middle of the night and they disappear, or journalists getting shot on the street or things like that. The kinds of stuff, the thuggish kind of behavior that, Putin and other kind of really vicious autocrats do. But I think precisely for that reason, it can be very easy for people to believe that it's not that bad and nothing's happening, because things look sort of normal.
Yeah, and that actually is going to be part of the point. I mean, the legitimacy of certain institutions, comes in part from certain symbols and language that's been used over the years that has sort of an unconscious credibility to us. And I think those symbols, those institutions can be appropriated or misappropriated, co-opted. That's the right word. Co-opted for a nefarious end. And I think, you were talking about scholars, and we can get into some of the names specifically later of people who we've been paying attention to. But one thing that has really stuck out to me is the examples of nations like Hungary and Poland. And looking to example like Hungary, for example, a nation that you had a right-wing populist who emerged there, and seeing how that country has sort of slid into an autocracy, I think is very instructive, because I think it's a better parallel than looking at something like you said, Vladimir Putin's Russia as an example.
Yes. So what are the main things that stood out to you or stand out to you?
Well, I do think it's sort of the cowering of institutions that at one time provided a check or a balance, right, to the power of an autocrat. So, one, I think, real focus that I'm looking for in 2025 is, how does the judiciary respond? I mean, ostensibly in the United States, the judiciary is a bulwark against any kind of tyranny that you could have. These are people who have life appointments, who have, ostensibly no incentive to do anything other than do whatever they think is right. And any threat of their independence should be met with a very aggressive counterpush by them, because that's where they get all their power, is their independence and the moral authority they have. But it's fair to say a lot of judges see a value in currying favor with Trump. And obviously, we've spent a lot of time in the podcast talking about judges like Aileen Cannon. I mean, what happens if she's nominated for the Supreme Court, for example, right? What sort of incentives are there going to be for judges to try to fall into line and push an agenda that ultimately kind of carries an imprimatur of the law and essentially uses the law as a way of carrying forward an agenda that is contrary to what we've understood the American Constitution to be about.
So I'm surprised that you jumped to the judges, because maybe this is where you and I'm being too idealistic. I feel like despite Aileen Cannon and some of these yahoos in Texas or whatever, I feel like judges have to be kind of almost the last line of defense against some of what we're going to see. Last week, I and George and Norm talked about the weaponization of libel laws, which is also from the autocracy playbook in these countries that you just mentioned, that, you know, they felt aren't going to go anywhere because not that they can't cause a lot of trauma and harassment by the time they get into court, but when they get into court, they're not going to be meritorious enough to withstand it. So, I don't know. Maybe we can come back to that. But I think what you're also, talking about right now, speaking of scholars, one of my colleagues and friends, Jason Stanley, who has written a book called How Fascism Works. I highly recommend it. It's a really easy read, but he basically has 10 pillars of fascism, many of which are already here. But number 2 is propaganda. And what he says is the language of democratic ideals takes on corrupted opposite meanings. Corrupt politicians run anti-corruption campaigns. Freedom of speech claims are used to suppress speech. And so, I think this is kind of hitting on what you're saying, is that the institution gets co-opted and then used for precisely the opposite of what it's supposed to be used for. In your case, when you're talking about judges, to undermine the rule of law as opposed to upholding it.
Right. I didn't mean to suggest that that's like the first domino to fall, but when you were talking to me, we were talking about these scholars and what really struck me about them. And what struck me about them is like, how did the independent judiciary of Hungary not fail to prevent that slide into fascism? And to me, that's the sort of thing when I'm thinking to myself, institutions that we have that actually could provide some counterweight, that would be it. I agree. I think that what you just said is already here. We already have words being, essentially it's almost like a 1984 where we have people, talking about freedom and patriotism and all of these things. And it means something very different, I think, than what you and I have always understood those terms to mean. And I do think the weaponization of the legal system to impose costs and to drive narratives existed certainly from the beginning of the first Trump presidency and before that. But I think what I'm trying to figure out is, okay, what's going to be the counterpunch, or what's going to hold the line? It's certainly not going to be the press. I think we're already seeing what I would call, some people I think have been calling sane-washing, right? And this has been going on for a while, where it's like Trump's like, yeah, I want to take over Greenland. I want to take over. And
they're like, Trump's ambitious geopolitical agenda for his second term, and you're like,
what?
Yeah, that's kind of violations of the laws of war, but okay.
Yeah, Trump considers U.S. expansion was CNN's headline for him talking about invading these countries. I mean, could you imagine that in like the 1930s? Like, Germany considers European expansion. It's like, well, I guess that's one way of putting it. I mean,
could you imagine it in 2010?
Yeah.
I mean, just to close the time gap on how much we've been the frogs boiling in the water at this point. But I agree with you. So fourth estate, the fourth estate, I guess, meaning the press, as it has traditionally been constituted in terms of mainstream media, I think is not going to be the guardrail. I do think that this is a disruption that is going to require a reimagining of the media space. And I think we've talked about this a little bit before, where there's more independent journalists or more platforms like Substack, which I think is allowing for actual media networks to be formed, for example, that people might start going to for more reliable information, or for, I guess in actual independent journalism that isn't guided by the agendas of some billionaire who cares about his bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I mean, I think one of the reasons, if we want to think about how we got here, I'm echoing, I think, something you've said in prior podcasts, Asha, is we've got here because we have millions of Americans who can't distinguish between truth and falsehood and are learning a lot of their quote unquote news based on what they see on social media. So they just see Facebook posts or TikTok reels or whatever they're looking at, and they're learning supposed facts or assertions this way, and they can't distinguish between what Charlie Savage at the New York Times says, based on very careful sourcing, versus what they're seeing on social media, whether it's X or Facebook or whatever, that is very highly distorted. And I think that problem remains, and I don't think there's an easy solution to it other than a proliferation of other sources of information. But there's still no way, there's no good way that I've seen to solve this problem of the fact that for every let's say person on Substack, like let's say Steve Vladeck, who we've had on, or yourself, who have very thoughtful Substacks that are fact based. How you compare that to like a Cenk Uygur, who's now selling out to Trump as sort of a grifter, trying to push a kind of right wing populist agenda.
Yeah, no, I'm by no means suggesting that it's going to be easy to solve. I just do think it's going to be fragmented for a while, as those traditional gatekeepers are kind of no longer trusted, I think, by everyone at this point. But you're right. So the point being that we're not going to be able to count on the mainstream media, I think, to provide the guardrail. That they've already shown that they are not intending to do that. What is next? I guess, we might have relied, I guess, if, you go back to 2016, there was a time when even with a ethically challenged incoming president, you could rely on the Department of Justice and the FBI to be independent. And,
right.
That was a guardrail, right? That if there was obstruction of justice or corruption happening behind the scenes, that they were going to investigate without fear or favor. I think, at least in terms of the leadership, that's clearly not going to be the case. So I think it remains to be seen what the rank and file are going to do. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on whether those people, if they find themselves in compromising situations, should they quit or should they make it harder and stick around and just use all of the mechanisms at their disposal, whether it's whistleblowing or going to the IG or whatever it is, to create more friction and to keep the administration from being able to achieve its agenda more quickly than it might otherwise, even if it's inevitable to some degree.
Well, they should create more friction. And I will tell you, since the election, I've talked to many current DOJ employees about issues related to this. And I think a lot of them are just planning to put their heads down and do their job, and they plan to stay there, and they plan to do what they believe is just in individual cases. And I do think that they can provide some friction. That said, it's easy for me or you sitting in our home offices to talk about, someone, putting themselves out there to create friction. And it's another thing for someone to decide to do that. And I will say, from a data perspective, okay, I just gave you an anecdotal thing. Like, here's conversations I'm having with people who feel a certain way. But when you look at the data, and one thing I pay attention to, separate and apart from the news that we talk about on here, is the news about the business of law firms. And so, because I'm a partner at a law firm and I have a lot, I put a lot of effort into that, my law practice, there are record numbers of people leaving the Justice Department right now. The entire, not only you have all the U.S. attorneys leaving and all of the DOJ leadership, but lots and lots of folks leaving and trying to get jobs at law firms right now, record numbers. And the reason why is because while it sounds good from a societal perspective and from doing the right thing perspective to create friction, These are people who have mortgages and families and need to make ends meet. And fighting a fight like that is not, conducive to having a happy life or potentially achieving whatever their personal goals are for their families. And it's easy to be the brave one when it's someone else's job on the line, so to speak.
I think it's partly that, but I think it's also kind of a collective action problem as well, that any one person doesn't believe that what their actions do are going to make a difference. So, I'm doing a lot of research now on moral courage, like what makes someone a truth teller in a system that's complicit, right? And one of the things that separates the people who do speak out, and we're talking about like corporate whistleblowers, we're talking about people who, blew the whistle on, CIA torture practices or whatever, name the context, and they're doing it. They actually have a really strong sense of agency and a belief that their actions are going to make an impact. And so it's as much a psychological thing, I think, as like a financial or practical thing as well. And I think it can be very easy to believe that what difference is it going to make if I stick around or not? I am just a rank and file DOJ lawyer. Other people will pick up the fight if it gets really bad. In other words, they just don't believe that they're going to make a difference. And I think that maybe the message that needs to get out to those people is that it does matter in every instance.
I agree that it does. And I think that the DOJ is particularly well positioned to have those individuals there. In other words, a lot of people who are line prosecutors, let's just say at the Justice Department, they believe of them. They think of themselves as white knights, so to speak. They think of themselves as people who are doing the right thing. They think of themselves as people who are serving an interest that is much greater than themselves. And they're hard to dislodge. They're also very savvy about the legal system, and they're used to enjoying a lot of protection over their actions. Like a lot of what they do is effectively immune from legal liability and are very close to it, close enough. And so can be very strident about doing the right thing. So I do think we're going to see that. But I'll note, Asha, that we saw a lot during Trump's first term. We saw a lot of brave action from DOJ folks, not just line folks like who actually resigned, for example, in the Michael Flynn case, but people who are higher than that in the Southern District of New York, for example, resisting pressure from Barr and others at the head of the Justice Department who are trying to pressure the Southern District to have certain prosecutions. And nonetheless, do you know the names of those people? Are we, how much were they able to move the needle? I mean, it's interesting. And I've said before, I do think a total failing of the Biden administration is a failure to really look back and re-examine 100%. What they did.
And just to underscore, how far we've fallen at the end, the people who were actually doing the standing up were Bill Barr and, Steve Engel, the people who threatened to resign en masse if Trump followed through on, trying to investigate false claims of voter fraud, et cetera, et cetera. We've hit rock bottom.
When Barr's your moral compass. Yeah, no kidding.
So yeah, I think you're right. I'm not sure that we're disagreeing really, but hopefully some people will stay around, make it harder, because to go to another scholar whose work I respect a lot and I've learned so much from, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's another colleague of ours, who's written the book Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present. Very readable, highly recommend it. But she has talked about this idea of how autocrats do something called what she calls hollowing out, that they hollow out institutions, I guess sort of like kind of basically creating vacuums that allow them to then repurpose it again in the same way that we talked about before to essentially do the opposite of what it was intended to do. And that's kind of why the friction is important, because the longer people stay around, the longer it's going to take to hollow out that institution.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you saw, of course, Trump trying to do that with the Senate and their advice and consent function, trying to make that essentially rubber stamp. You can, I think, see him trying to do the same thing with the Justice Department, using that as a weaponization. I mean, it's an irony, and it's that the point you made from your colleague who had talked about how words have the opposite meaning, right? We've talked a lot on this podcast about the supposed weaponization committee, which of course was all about enabling Trump's weaponization of the Justice Department. And that's exactly what he intends to do. I mean, that's what the nomination of Kash Patel, I think, signifies, really.
Yeah. And just a note, I saw an article that William Webster, who is the only person to have served as both the director of the FBI and the director of the CIA, and is also 100 years old, like literally, just spoke out and against the nomination of Kash Patel and of Tulsi Gabbard, and said that these are two people who are simply not suitable for the positions to which they've been nominated. So I think that's notable. Just making a note of that.
It is. And I think we'll really see in the days ahead whether the United States Senate has backbone, whether Thune and the Republican senators are going to stand up to some of these nominees. I mean, it's notable, I think, that Mitch McConnell has got RFK stuck in his craw because he really does not like the vaccine piece of things. But some of the others, like you just mentioned, will they stand up or will they end up rubber stamping those nominees? I think one thing that gives me hope, because I'm going to be the sunny person for a moment, is the Democrats in the House. I thought they really showed a tremendous amount of organization recently in holding together and keeping their votes together and refusing to support anything that the Republicans are doing unless they had a seat at the table. Given the razor thin margin that there is in the House, and given the disorganization and the various splinters within the Republican caucus, I think they have an opportunity to prevent a lot of injustice, at least on the legislative front. I mean, sadly, there's so much the executive can do without getting laws passed, but I do think that is a check that might actually have some value in the years, at least until the next midterm.
Yeah, and I would hope that there are some Republicans who are at least, kind of savvy about national security and intelligence, people who've served on the, intelligence committees or armed services committees, about the actual danger to the country, to them, to ordinary people, if you get the wrong kind of people specifically in the positions to head intelligence agencies, including the FBI, which monitors counterintelligence, and the DNI. That might make them pause, right? And this is what William Webster was saying, is he said, this can really impact, this can make us less safe if our allies stop sharing information with us, if, there are leaks of classified intelligence that we're getting, or we go down on certain sources because, for political reasons, that has a major impact on our day-to-day lives, potentially. And I think on this front, I just wanted to throw out there, as we're looking ahead, I don't know exactly where this fits in, but we were talking about propaganda earlier and TikTok. A federal district judge just upheld the TikTok divestment. So they are still under orders to divest, or I guess they can't be distributed here on platforms here in the U.S. As of January 19th. And the court dismissed the First Amendment claims that TikTok was making because, as you know, Renato, the government's burden when there's a First Amendment claim is that it has to show that the proposed action is narrowly tailored to fulfill a compelling government interest. And the district judge at least found that the national security concerns were compelling enough. So I'm just pointing out that, I think when you get to national security stuff, it is worth paying attention because nobody wants something blown up or our critical infrastructure going down, or most people don't.
Well, we've talked about institutions, and I think the most important institution to watch in 2025 is the United States military, since we're talking about national security. Yeah. I mean, there's no question that Trump is taking aim at the independence and non-politicization of the military. Obviously, that group of retired generals that he talked about, which we've discussed briefly in the past, but that's what I'm going to be watching more closely than anything else, because that is really his road to taking things in a very radical direction. He's only got really a few years before everyone's focused on the next term and what that looks like. And the military would be a way of trying to take extra constitutional steps. Let's put it that way.
Yes. Well, that's, again, that's one of the bulwarks against tyranny is, well, first of all, the idea was, having civilian control of the military, but also one of the things that I always talk about when I teach national security law is how the appropriations for the Army is every 2 years versus, the longer term for the Navy, for example. And it's because the framers did not want a large standing army that could be, commandeered by a chief executive who has so much power. And I think January 6th showed Trump that the professionalization and the diversity of the military, as well as, the strong norms to follow the Constitution, the UCMJ, all of these things that that soldiers, officers are inculcated in, stand in his way of essentially appropriating this institution. And I think this has actually we're paying attention to it now, but this is something that I think I was watching it start a long time ago when I believe it was Stephen Miller who was trying to stop pathways for immigrants who serve in the military as a pathway to citizenship. He did not like that. Mm-hmm. Not rewarding the people who were, acting as translators, et cetera, in war zones to get a pathway to citizenship, trying to, basically homogenize in a lot of different ways, including removing, kind of saying that, more or less that gay people or trans people shouldn't be in the military, that white nationalists are okay. We shouldn't be purging extremism. I mean, all of these things are trying to essentially create a homogenized institution where that then these other aspects, the professionalization, the loyalty to the Constitution, the diversity are not there, and which will allow Trump to more easily, I think, control it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I will. One thing that is hopeful, and I think is, if I'm trying to be forecasty, so to speak,
be forecasty.
I mean, one thing we did see this last week was some static between Elon Musk and folks like Laura Loomer and other right wingers who did not like him, speaking out in favor of H-1B visas and expanding H-1B visas, which are the visas that are used generally by very highly educated, for highly educated foreign workers to come in and work for companies like Tesla and SpaceX.
For special skills visa, you have to show that you have a special skill, and or the employer has to show that they need a special skill and that they can't find people here
that can do it. To fill those needs, and it's actually been something that has it's really enabled the United States to brain drain a lot of other countries. Candidly, it's been, I'd say, something that strengthened the United States. But there's been a tension there and a disagreement, and it's easy to talk about platitudes. It's different when you actually need to govern and there's policy on the line. And I think the two things that I'm really looking for, two things that I am looking for in 2025 are there policy differences and disagreements that ultimately disunify the Trump coalition and the Republicans? Okay, first of all. And two, will there be policy moves that Trump makes that actually cause people to push back? Like right now, Asha, I think there's a true fatigue out there. And it's like people feel like we've tried everything and we lost. We've given everything we can, and the country has chosen Trump again. But, when he puts children in cages, will that change, right? I mean, when that happened, when he separated children from his parents, right, there was a national reaction to that. Will there be policy moves that Trump makes that spur an intense reaction? We just don't know yet.
Yeah, we don't know. And I think in terms of the internal fighting, I mean, I do think that basically the incorporation of these white nationalists into, I guess, the Republican Party, definitely the MAGA movement, is kind of a problem, right? I mean, this is what gets to the Elon Musk issue with the visas. I mean, I was seeing I went back on Twitter just to kind of lurk a little bit, and it was interesting. Somebody had posted, JD Vance had retweeted somebody, so I guess some white nationalist person who said something about the price of eggs or something like that, and he was boosting this person, and then that same person turned around and said, there's just too many Indians in this country, they all need to go. And
Wow.
of course, JD Vance's wife is
Indian
American, and so there is at some point going to be some collision course of the people that are in power. I mean, Asha Vance will be the second lady, but Vivek Ramaswamy is there working with Elon Musk. I believe there are other Indians and Asians that Trump has floated for people. I mean, Kash Patel, obviously, as the head of the FBI. I have to wonder at what point the white nationalists, and this is where like the Laura Loomer types come in, and the Ann Coulters and stuff are gonna, raise a fuss, and then what's gonna happen then?
Yeah, I do think that people have a tendency to over homogenize their opponents, so to speak. They think of them as the sort of other blob, right? Like the Borg or something. And the truth of the matter is, Republicans are a diverse coalition, and there's people, you can't to say that Mitch McConnell and Laura Loomer have the exact same thoughts and have the same policy views. It's just not the case. So it'll be interesting to see. But that's, if I'm looking for something to happen in 2025, I mean, that is really, between the House Democrats making the Republicans, forcing them to hang together 100% in order to get anything done, and the Republicans actually having true disagreements because they're not identical people. I think that is a possibility for preservation of our values as much as possible in the next year or two.
Yeah, I agree. And it's actually taking a page from the Republican playbook. I think they've always been very successful at sticking together no matter what. That's always been, the strength that I think we've seen that eroded in a weird way. And I think that's something that Democrats can capitalize on, because it's going to be a mess.
For sure. So, Asha, before we go, I literally just got back from the barber. I have totally changed my beard at my wife's request. What do you even notice a difference, or do like guys when they have facial hair, it's just always the same no matter what?
I would not have noticed the difference until you asked me.
Okay.
I can tell that it's well groomed.
Okay. It's much shorter.
It's a little less Grizzly Adams looking. And can we just pause for a second? Because, you know that I am now back out in the dating world.
Whoa. Gentlemen of the world, watch out.
Yeah. And here's the thing. I need to be honest. I don't love facial hair. I don't love facial hair. And this whole Grizzly Adams look that like everybody is doing now does not do it for me.
It's interesting. So I'll tell you, I never liked facial hair. I did not have facial hair for the first 40 something years of my life, 44, 45 years of my life. I started during the pandemic, not shaving every day. And my wife really liked it. She was not my wife at the time, I think, or I don't remember. Yeah, we were dating at the time. Maybe this was 4 or 5 years ago. And she really encouraged me to grow it out. What I noticed, I will tell you, Asha, is it dramatically changed how people, it definitely changed how people perceived me. I have a baby face, and if I don't have a beard, I look 10 years younger than my age. Like I'm 48. I look like I'm in my 30s. But I definitely look a lot older with the beard and the white hair and the beard.
100%. And this is my problem with it.
Interesting. For as a lawyer, it helps because
everyone's
clients
so
like
old.
it.
I'm like, why do you do that to yourself? You look old.
But it helps. I mean, it definitely gives me a gravitas that helps in the courtroom and with clients and stuff like that.
Yeah, I get that. I don't think it would help you on Bumble.
That's interesting. Probably not. I've noticed that I get a lot less attention, but my wife likes it. So
yeah.